Tucker Carlson came to Texas this week, speaking at a fundraising event for the Tarrant County Republican Party. He addressed the invasion at the southern border. He talked about the spiritual battle taking place all across our country and indeed the world. Texas Scorecard was there to report. Here's our exclusive video of Tucker Carlson's event from this week.
Thank you for having me. I've been told not to lean on this podium or it will fall over. I'm grateful to be here. I'm not really sure how I got here, but I'm really thankful. No, I got here because of the great Beau French, who I love, and so I'm going to, I have a tendency, I'm not elected to anything, but I can talk like a politician. It's like unbelievable how much I can talk, so I'm gonna try and keep my rambling to a minimum and get right to a conversation with Beau. But first I just wanna thank you. This is the second week in a row I've been in Texas. Half my family lives in Texas. Half my children live in Texas. I would say, at this point, it's true. Most of my relatives live in Texas. And we were at a memorial service for a family member last weekend, and all my many children came, including the ones who already live here. And we're just having brunch, and one of my relatives comes to me and says, "Can you come here for a sec?" "Of course." "Do you mind if I pray for you?" "Of course." There's one thing I like is being prayed for. And this person puts her hands on me and says this prayer out loud to Jesus, and I'm thinking, first of all, oh, thank you. And second, this does not happen to me where I live. And that very thing just happened to me right before I came out here. Somebody, "Can you come here for a sec?" "Sure, of course. I'll go anywhere you ask me to go, by the way." That's how I wound up here. And this man, I'm not gonna call him out by name and embarrass him, puts his hands on me and prays for God's guidance. And I thought, no, really? And all of you are probably thinking, well, yeah, that's what we do in Texas. That is not what they do in other states. And it is the thing that makes the state different, really different from any other place. The fact that you have a county sheriff who goes to hospitals to pray with dying prison inmates or jail inmates, that's the most wonderful thing I've heard all day. That does not happen anywhere else. And the fact, and I know no backstory here. I mean, I met your sheriff, who I said, you were just created to be a sheriff. If I saw you in the crafts aisle at Walmart, I would know you're a sheriff. And I meant that as a compliment. I'm like Trump that way. I think you should do what you look like you should be doing. But the fact that his prayers for dying inmates are the reason that he's hated and he's the #1 target, that just tells you everything right there. And it makes you feel like a fool if, like me, you've spent 30 years imagining this was like a political debate or a policy debate. We have different visions of how to make things better. No, that's not what this is at all. If you're mad about someone saying prayers, we're on different teams on the deepest level. That's the truth. And the forces running this are not celestial forces. They're just not. This is not flesh and blood at all. If you're offended by prayer, you're taking orders, okay? And I don't see another rational explanation for it at all. And so you should keep that in mind as you face down this election. And of course, it's an honor to be in Tarrant County, famously the biggest red county, really the only remaining population center in the United States, if I could say. I don't know where Oklahoma City is these days, but this is the prize for the people who want to stop sheriffs from praying for dying inmates. Like, if that offends you, first of all, if it offends you when people acknowledge God, what are you saying? You're saying what God himself has said, "No gods before me." You think you're God. And so it outrages you that someone would acknowledge a power higher than you. And for me, politics is really simple. I divide all players in the political arena into two categories: people who think they're God and people who know they're not. And I'm on the side of those who know they're not. The most underrated quality in politics, and in fact the rarest quality in politics, is also the most important quality in life, and it's the only route to salvation and any semblance of holiness, and that's humility. And that's always the first step, is acknowledging how sort of ridiculous you are. And if you don't believe it, put a mirror outside your shower. And no, I'm serious. I don't have one because I know. I live with the ever-present knowledge of my absurdity. But if I ever had delusions of awesomeness, I would install that mirror just as a daily reminder that I am merely a man, furry in the wrong places, kind of lumpy. You know what I mean? Kind of ridiculous, actually. And that right there, not that I'm a particularly wise person, but to the extent I have any wisdom at all, it's rooted in that knowledge. I cannot foresee the future. I have no power to change it. I can't change people. They weren't made by me. They were made by a power higher than me. I don't make the rules. I'm not in charge of nature. I'm not even in control of the weather. Doesn't matter how many wind farms I build. I can't change the weather because I didn't make the earth in 6 days. No, someone else did that. So if you dissent from that, and if you're the person to stand up and say, actually, I don't think you're God, you're actually kind of just John Kerry. That's all it takes to get on their list for total destruction. That's so offensive. You are putting other gods above them. And they hate you for that, and they'll punish you for it. And if you're running a nationwide political campaign, you're really going after the biggest clusters of resistance, and that would mean that this county is #1 on the list. And you'll notice what they're not doing, which is what you would do in an actual democracy. You would make the case. You would get on television or on the internet or standing in front of a crowd in a building like this, and you would say, here's my vision for your future and for the lives that your grandchildren will live, and here's why I think it's better than the other guys. You know, a chicken in every pot, a car in every garage, or whatever. But that's the one thing they never do. They never stand up and say, you know, the other side is promising you this, I'm promising you that. Not one time do they say that, because they can't. Because what they're promising is death. What they're promising you is no grandchildren, which is literally death. Your line dies. And I don't think there's a chapter in the Old Testament where children aren't described as synonymous with wealth. You want to know if you're prosperous? You want to know if you're in God's favor? How many kids do you have? How many grandkids do you have? How are they doing? That's the oldest and most basic, and will always be the most basic measure of prosperity. How are your descendants? And what they're promising you, every person in this room, is no descendants. No descendants. It's really that simple. You can reduce all these debates about climate or crime, all the weird sex stuff. I'm not even going to dignify it with a name. I'm just going to call it that weird sex stuff. But if they're promising you the opportunity to castrate your children, what are they really promising you? No grandchildren. The end of your line. And Solomon and David would instantly recognize that as an act of total war against you and your people. Period. Because that's what that is. So they can't say any of this out loud because there's not one person who wants that product, extinction. There's not one person who wants that. And so if they're going to take and maintain power, they need to get it another way, a non-democratic way. And the way they're going to do that, and the way they are doing it as we speak, is by changing the population of the country. And I have to say, I don't want to scold anyone. I bragged about my ties to Texas, which are extensive, but I don't live here. I'm not a Texan, only by aspiration. But I have to say, every time I come to your state, I feel like it really is. We grew up, my brother Buckley, who's sitting in the front row, and I grew up in an Episcopalian family where sort of saying things out loud was not necessarily rewarded. And sort of the highest measure of achievement was ignoring things. That's just our culture. So it really is, Texas feels like an Episcopalian Christmas dinner where there's one very drunk person at the table and no one says a word about it. And at this point, he's passed out face first and is drowning in pea soup, and people just go on like it's not even happening. And I, as an Anglo, I sort of admire that. I admire that. I admire the politeness that informs that posture. But I feel like that every time I come to the state because you're being invaded. You're literally being invaded. And no one says anything about it. So if you think of all the issues, and there are just too many to keep track of, I get texts every day, by the hundreds, stories that would make you cry, every one of them. And so my job, to the extent I have a job, is to try to put them in some order of importance and try to attack the most important ones first. And if you assess it rationally, changing the population of your country in order to win elections on the cusp of an economic downturn is the single most destructive thing you could ever do to a country. And it's happening here. This is the port of entry for millions and millions of non-Americans. And there are a lot of ways to describe the people who come here illegally from other countries. One is just illegals. Another is undocumented migrants. But I would just reduce it to the way I see it, which is not American. And one of the reasons that no one talks about it is because everybody feels kind of dirty saying it, like it's something about race or something, or even national origin. No, it's not. It's really simple. It's fundamental to the idea of a country. We have a country. The people who live here are residents and citizens of that country. They choose their leaders. We call the system democracy. If you let millions of other people from other countries come in and choose our leaders, you no longer have democracy, do you? And we're not really in charge of our country, are we? No, we're not. So it's not a question of where they're coming from. And by the way, I think there are all kinds of questions about that. And if you've got a huge number of people coming from China here or the Middle East with radical politics that we actually don't want, one of the beauties of the America I grew up in is we didn't have all these like weird international proxy wars going on within our borders. I grew up in California where you had lots of Armenians and there were some Turks. And there were not daily gun battles or demonstrations in the streets between the Armenians and the Turks, despite the fact that 50 years before, one group had genocided the other. The Muslims had committed genocide against the Christians, and we lived among those Christians, those Armenians. And I think they felt it deeply. And when they sat at their Armenian table at home, they would talk about it. But they did not bring that ancient hatred into the public sphere because they were all Americans. The Armenians and the Turks were all Americans. So if you import people from around the world and you don't ask them to assimilate into American culture and adopt the values of the United States to the exclusion of all others, you're going to have, and we are seeing it now, ancient hatreds and battles from around the world play out on your streets, which are yours, not theirs. You'll see the total destruction of the country. So what I don't understand is, why does nobody say this? It's because they feel guilty and they don't want to feel dirty or naughty or racist. It's not about race. It's about who has a right to live here. Well, Americans do. Who has a right to decide who else lives here? Americans do. And I feel like Texas is especially susceptible to this because Texas has such a long history of people from different parts of the world living together in total harmony. A state like California had massive demographic change, and it completely destroyed the state. And I would talk to, in the town that my brother and I grew up in, the county we grew up in, we couldn't live there now. The state's insane. It was the best state, the richest state, the most functioning state, best infrastructure, best schools. It's at the bottom for all of those. You can't live there unless you're really rich. And I'm not there, so I'm not living there. I would talk to my cousins in Texas, and they would say, we've got, multicultural, we've got different cultures living here, but our Texans with Hispanic last names have been here for 300 years, and we all get along. And I was like, that's the coolest thing ever. And I still think that. I think it's the coolest thing ever. But there's something about that experience that convinced Texans that if you just open the border and millions of people come from all over the world, not even Latin America, but every region of the world, that it's gonna work out. Oh, it's not gonna work out at all. Not for Texas and not for the country. Because there's no reason to do this except to destroy the current system that we have and replace it with another system with different people in charge. That's exactly what's going on. And I have to say, I know I'm at the Tarrant County this is like an actual Republican Party event. So, I should just say, I don't want to attack the governor, who's a Republican, whom I know. Totally charming, nice guy, and I think a good guy in a lot of ways. Certainly been governor for a long time. I'm sure everyone in this room voted for him. I probably would have voted for him too if the option was a Democrat, but I just have to say, I don't understand how you could be governor of a state in 2020 and all of a sudden the border opens up and you get invaded and you don't do anything about it. And I don't understand that. I don't understand that as someone who watches politics for a living, but on a much deeper and more fundamental level, I don't understand that as a man, and I don't understand that as a father. The leadership model is the patriarchal model. It's dad. And the first requirement of being dad is loving your kids and your wife. In fact, that's the only real requirement. I know tons of good dads who are kind of dumb and half drunk, and they're still pretty good dads. Why? Because they sincerely love their wife and children, and they would give their lives for their wife and children, their families. That's the core requirement. And as long as you meet that requirement, you'll do an okay job. If you don't meet that requirement, you will be a disaster and your kids will wind up in rehab. That is just a fact. And I apply that same model to every sphere of life, from the military to the boardroom and absolutely to the political arena. If you're governor of the state, you love the people who live in that state, no matter who they voted for, no matter what they look like, no matter what language they speak. If they're residents of your state, you love them, and you make every decision with their best interest in mind. And allowing millions of people to invade your state is like having home invaders show up at your house and run out the back door and let your wife and kids deal with it. It is contemptible. It is a violation of the most basic arrangement in life. And the most basic arrangement in life is, I'm in charge, and I will die for you in exchange for the privilege of being in charge. And if you won't, you shouldn't be in charge. So I didn't understand, okay, well, we can't send the National Guard. Well, how about every armed man in Texas? There are quite a few. I know a lot of them. I mean it. Oh, you're so radical. You're so radical. Really? How many community hospitals have closed in the last 3 years? How many schools are so dysfunctional you couldn't even visit them at this point? The institutions that we and our ancestors, the ancestors of every American, spent 250 years building are now collapsing in front of our eyes because of this. And it doesn't even matter if every single one of the 10 million people who came here illegally from around the world is like a great person, super smart, super talented. That doesn't even matter. What matters is we didn't invite them. They broke the law coming here. If you wind up in a country by breaking the law, that's not a good start. If you come to my house and kidnap my daughter, I'm not going to give you permission to marry her. That's not a good way to start the relationship, okay? But even if every single one of them was a NASA engineer, it's too many people for any country to digest in too short a period. You will cause social chaos. And so we need to understand that the purpose of this is first political. It's to make Tarrant County blue. And if my experience growing up in the state of California, I'm only 54, by the way, I'm not 104. This just happened. If my experience is any measure of the future that awaits you, be careful, and I mean it. And the second objective is not a political objective, it's a spiritual objective, and it's to destroy the good. It's to bring chaos out of order. Chaos out of order. I'll stop with this. We don't appreciate the importance of order in the spiritual realm. What's the first thing that God did? All Christians, all Jews, all Muslims believe the same thing. God created order out of chaos. Genesis 1 through 6 is the template, not just for the rest of the Bible, but for the world as we find it. It's just true. Order out of chaos. Order out of chaos is it's the first and most obvious sign of good. Chaos out of order is the most obvious sign of evil. If you're creating chaos, you are by definition acting on behalf of evil. It's literally that simple. And we're like, oh, good and bad. It's so complicated to know what's good and bad. No, it's not complicated. You will judge the tree by its fruits. And if the fruit is chaos, you're looking at an evil tree, period. So my only totally unsolicited, probably unwelcome advice is to take your politicians by the scruff of the neck and say, you're not getting another dollar from me until every public remark you make is about the issue that actually matters, which is the one that has the capacity in the near short term to turn our state into California. And if you don't think that's a big deal, spend a week driving around the state, through the Central Valley, the most fertile farmland in the world, even along I-5, along the beaches, the richest real estate in the world, and see what's happened. That's the issue.